Please welcome to the stage Ben Lamm and Daryl Etherington.
Hello. All right, Ben, Austin native?
Austin native.
Amazing. This is my first time here, but I
Yeah,
did buy the shirt here.
You do dress the part better.
So I'm really trying to fit in as well.
Yeah, you nailed it.
So we saw that video, got a great sizzle reel. It's a little out of date. There's some additional animals, I think, that aren't even mentioned in there.
We're gonna make a new one. You know, the Mammoth didn't quite make SNL like the Dodo, so as we're working on a new sizzle reel.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to that. But yeah, like this is audacious. You yourself are an audacious person, I would say. You founded a lot of different companies.
Is that based on our podcast last week?
Based on our podcast, based on just seeing your name over the years associated with a lot of different things in a lot of different worlds. Last time I think we spoke before our podcast was re-recorded. Thank you, by the way. That's a plug. If you listen to the
if you listen to the Found podcast.
Yeah,
it's coming. I think we could use about 30% of it. So.
Yeah, but you know, it was hyperspectral, and you were doing space and defense stuff there. But now you're doing woolly mammoths and dodos and what's the word again? Because I always want to say
De-Extinction.
No, the other animal. The
thylacine.
The thylacine.
Yeah, or Tasmanian tiger, whatever.
Right.
How you flip.
So de-extinction overall. So how did you get from there to here?
It was a complete accident. So George Church, who's arguably the father of synthetic biology, he invented a lot of the technologies around read, write, and editing, and definitely kind of pioneered synthetic biology, actually engineering genomes. I called him, I actually just cold call him to talk to him about could we use software and AI and automation to actually create a platform to make it easier for bench scientists to get to discoveries faster, right? Because all the biology software we saw was pretty bad, my background mostly being in software. And I called them, and I'm weirdly curious. So I was like, what else are you working on? He started talking about like how he's like making neurons, like regenerating neurons. He's working on stuff to combat climate change. And then, he did this like weird Steve Jobs one last thing where he's like, it's like the last 10 minutes or like 2 minutes of the call. He's like, I'm also working to bring back woolly mammoths to put them back into the Arctic to help replenish the biodiversity there. And I've got to go to my next meeting. Goodbye. And so I was like absolutely shocked because this was like one of the greatest minds in the world, arguably one of the smartest people on the planet. And he dropped I'm going to bring back extinct animals. I got to go plug. Yeah. And so I stayed up all night, watched all these videos and read all these interviews with George, and regardless of who he was talking to, whether it was 60 Minutes or you guys or someone else, there was always this through line of the mammoth. And it was very clear that when he started talking about it, his voice changed and he was just massively excited about it. Yeah. And so a week and a half later, I was in his lab. We both missed all of our meetings that day. And I was like, okay, great. I got to go figure out how to build a de-extinction company.
Wow. So, but like, what is it that to you saw an opportunity like this is good for the world? Because it's cool.
Yeah.
It's undeniably cool, and I think there's various reactions, but one of the most common reactions I see.
Generally positive.
Generally positive, right. But when we talk about this to people, or we write articles about it, you just hear like, that's great, like, do it, why not? But there is also the why. Why is still a really big question.
What's crazy is a lot of people don't know this, but we're going to lose up to 50% of all biodiversity between now and 2050 if we don't do anything. Like a lot of people are talking about carbon sequestration. A lot of people are talking about methane suppression. People are, I think we've gotten over the hump that the general public believes in man-made climate change. Yeah. But loss of biodiversity and ecosystem collapse is something that not enough people are talking about. And, I don't think of Colossal as a insurance policy, but I think that if we can develop incredible technologies to help bring back keystone extinct species while developing technologies that have applications to human healthcare, we're kind of building this de-extinction toolkit that other conservation groups can use to help preserve existing biodiversity. And so all of the technologies that Colossal makes that have an application to conservation are free. Oh. So we're working with a lot of really great nonprofits, and they get access to all of our technologies for free because we think that there's a lot of really great opportunities to monetize the business, and we just don't think that monetizing conservation is really that important.
So what about, you mentioned keystone species. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means? Like
Yeah, so in an ecosystem, I think one of the kind of most notable examples of rewilding of a keystone species, so putting a keystone species back into the environment that was removed, I think a lot of people, especially in the U.S., like know the story of wolves in Yellowstone. So wolves were culled from Yellowstone in 1925. 70 years later, they reintroduced this keystone species, which is this animal that is required, and it's absolutely critical, or a keystone, for that environment and for that environment to thrive. And so they reintroduced them back in 1995, and ever since, the park has really, really flourished. Like the right populations of the herding animals, right migration of the herding animals, songbirds, beavers, all these other different animals have come back to the park by reintroducing this keystone species.
Oh, great. So that's like, basically it's just like the linchpin for the local ecosystem. Or
yeah, it's for that ecosystem. And mankind has typically had a history of going into environments, finding the biggest, slowest keystone species, and murdering it.
Right,
So, yeah.
right. So that maybe brings us to some of the other species you're working on.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about what was your selection process? Like, were you just looking around and thinking, like, what's the funniest looking animal that we can bring back, or was there more to it?
No, there was a reasonable amount of thought in it. We wanted to bring back species that people wanted to bring back, species where mankind had a role or sole role in their extinction, and ones that were actually possible to do, right? So there's other species that we're really excited about, like the Steller sea cow, which was, there's been some really interesting scientific papers come out that show the importance that it had on the kelp forests of the Pacific Northwest, but there's nothing that we can gestate it in. There's surrogacy just isn't an option until we get ex utero development working. We really can't. There's certain species we can't go after. So, making sure that we could actually do it was critical. And then we leaned heavily on our scientific advisors and folks that worked with the company. So we had this goal of like, what can we do? What should we do, and why should we do it? We eradicated the dodo, we eradicated the thylacine. Lots of papers suggest that early man had a hand in the de-extinction the extinction of Columbian and northern mammoths. And and Beth Shapiro, who's one of our scientific advisors and lead paleogeneticist, she introduced us to Andrew Pask, who'd been working similar to George's story, had been working on a shoestring budget for 15 years on the thylacine, and it was kind of the next great species to work on.
Right.
And then she just also happened to have the dodo genome that she'd worked on for 20 years, so it was kind of a linear progression. So if you aren't happy, Beth may be a good person to call.
Right. So yeah, I think this came up on the podcast, but like it's kind of like you're crowdsourcing ideas, kind of like you're going to who has built like the existing extant information that can actually make the thing possible.
Well, not all that even exists.
Right.
And so like reference genomes for some of these species, like coming from software, I just assumed that there was just some magic database with with like all life on Earth like backed up on Google, right? Like why didn't Google do this? And because if you look at the rates at which prices have come down on sequencing, we're spending anywhere from $6,000 to $10,000 for birds to build reference genomes, upwards of like $25,000 to build reference genome. That's something that's highly doable, right? Like that's something that like corporations should fund, and there's lots of really great nonprofits out there, like the Vertebrate Genome Project that we support. And so like before we can even work on the ancient DNA, we had to build reference genomes for the existing species, because that still doesn't exist, and that money just needs to go into, that's a form of genetic rescue and conservation that no one's really focused on.
Right, and I think we've heard a lot about seed catalogs, but not really so much on the animals.
Yeah, there's great places, like San Diego's done a great job with the Frozen Zoo and others, but that's one place, right? We kind of need this distributed. We also need to ensure that we're actually backing up not just the cell lines and the materials, but we're actually spending the money on the sequencing as well.
Okay. So, but take me through when you're building out an extinct animal's genome. Does it mean that when you do create that animal again, is it identical genetically to the past animal, or is it an approximation, or what's going on there?
So we want to create proxy species. So what we define as success is a species that essentially can replace the ecological void that was created from its absence, number one, and that's our primary goal. And secondary, we do want to we're de-extincting the core genes that make up those core phenotypes or physical attributes of it, right? So if we make a cold-tolerant elephant but it doesn't really look like a mammoth, we don't know if that's a win. If we make an an elephant that looks like a mammoth by de-extincting it, but it's not cold tolerant and it can go, skiing, well then that didn't win either. And so for us, like you really have to do both. And so we aren't trying to create clones.
Yeah.
We're not trying, like in the case of the mammoth, it would be, over 1 million edits to like even though an Asian elephant's 99.6% a mammoth genetically, it's actually closer related to an Asian elephant, it's closer related to a mammoth than it even is to an African elephant, which blew my mind.
Yeah.
But what's interesting though is that we'd have to make over 1 million edits. We're just targeting about 65 genes that kind of represent the cold tolerance and the core phenotypes that we're looking for.
Okay. So back to what you were talking about, like keystone species, like basically it's something that can occupy that spot in the ecosystem, but is not necessarily exactly that animal.
Yeah, I think that at some point, from a scientific perspective, if some other company wants to go through the pursuit of getting to 100%, that's probably interesting, but it's not something that we're focused on.
Not necessary.
Yeah.
So
I think that'd be today impossible from a technology perspective, and I think it would also at some point be very costly.
This brings me to my dumbest question, so you're gonna have to forgive me this. But can you then make like Pokemon? Like, can you just make a real Pokemon?
So we live in a world right now of thoughtful answer. We live in a world of genetic reconciliation where we're combining genomes to ensure that those de-extincted genes are back to produce the phenotypes or physical attributes we're looking for. We aren't going to ever focus on Pokemon. That's not on our roadmap. But from a synthetic biology perspective, I really think at some point humanity now has the power, and at some point will have the ability to engineer a lot of adaptations. I think rather than engineering Pokemon, it's probably more interesting to make like coral, heat tolerant and salinity tolerant, right? So I think there's bigger issues. Like maybe after we solve all of the man-made climate change issues, we can start getting weird. But
okay. So it won't be long.
Yeah. We have a small problem that we should fix before we eradicate ourselves. But once we do that, then sure, Pokemon may be on the table for somebody.
Okay.
Just probably not us.
Yeah, I'll apologize again for that.
It's a reasonable question. It's not the weirdest question we've been asked today.
What is the weirdest question?
I can't. We get asked a lot about Neanderthals, which is.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it gets.
Okay.
We got asked about like 20 minutes ago.
Huh. So I do want to get back just kind of like to the business and maybe just how do you envision it, like when it's successful, like what does it look like? Like how is it operating? What do you imagine would be kind of the revenue? What are you doing on a daily basis? How many species are you working on? Can you give us a kind of
so right now we're working on 3 species, the mammoth, the thylacine, and the dodo. We are exploring other opportunities, right? Like obviously we've done some research on the stellar sea cow.
Yep.
We've done some other research on kind of some Americana species that have gone extinct and whatnot. So we are kind of doing early computational biology explorations, but 1 species is pretty hard, and we're working on 3, with one of them being avian.
Which is very different. What you explained to me, and I didn't even think about, like, mammalian to avian.
It's totally different. I mean, parts of it are a lot easier, right? Like eggs are self-contained and much easier than ex utero development or working with surrogates. And so there are parts of that project that are pretty interesting. And we've shown early, when you look at what we're doing, it's a systems problem, right? And so a lot of times in science, or when you're working on a project, you work on like one solution. It's in science, they'll work on a series of problems. They'll find one problem. They'll write a series of papers around that core problem, and that can be really valuable to humanity. It can be interesting economically for investors, but fundamentally, we have to look at de-extinction as a systems problem. So when you do that, you start to see a lot of different problems in areas of some invention, but a lot of innovation. And so we look to monetize all the technologies that come from it. So very similar to like the Apollo program, which was actually a moonshot, and it works. So it's like that worked. I mean, we're in good shape. And so if we are on that same path, then I think we can develop technologies for software, wetware, and hardware that have application to human healthcare. And we did that last year. So we spun out our first technology company and raised and oversubscribed around software. Given the background,
Form Bio, right?
Form Bio.
Yeah. And so that is like a sort of example of what you would imagine as you progress. More things like that.
More things like that. I think that we've got a couple of really interesting models for how we're inserting large cargoes of DNA into mammalian genomes and also doing multiplex editing. And so we've got these tools that we're developing also in the lab bench that have huge applications to what we're working on at Colossal, but could have huge applications to biotechs and other drug discovery companies as well.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. I think the other question, like this, what you're talking about reminds me actually of another conversation I had with Ugur Sahin, the founder of BioNTech, right? Like he said they were also taking a systems approach,
yeah,
which is very different. A lot of biotech companies you see are tackling that one specific therapy or something like that, and then they just get bought up by Pfizer.
That's one of the things that when we raised capital was interesting. We had to, you talk to certain folks, they got real excited about the business. Then you talked about traditional biotech investors, but when does the Mammoth go through phase 1 clinical trials?
Right.
It doesn't go through phase 1 clinical trials. And so it's interesting, it's a different kind of paradigm than what a lot of things that are out there that people have funded. And so we had to really be thoughtful about who to bring in. But I think that looking at I think that a lot of biotechs and other drug discovery companies should really focus on those point solutions because I think those are really helpful, like what we saw in COVID. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, if we can look at systems and platforms that we can apply, I think we can solve or give better tools to much smarter people than go work on them.
Yeah, and so you just brought up some of your investors. So what does that look like for you? How did you pick the folks you picked? I know you've got Thomas Tull from Legendary in there, a lot of big names.
So
they're not traditional investors. You're not a traditional investment, right?
Yeah, well, I think we're a new category. We're a one of one category to our knowledge. I don't know what that means, we're a category. But we were very, very thoughtful on the approach, right? And so we wanted really thoughtful, long-term investors that had a deep bench in technology. So a lot of people know Thomas from his stint at creating and being the CEO of Legendary Pictures, right? But most people don't realize that Legendary Pictures is actually a tech company. And so one of the reasons why it was so successful and had so many blockbusters was because they used they had an entire technology suite that they used to kind of pick and vet movies, right? Which is really interesting. Yeah. And now he's got USIT, which is one of the US's biggest technology and defense innovation funds. And so having folks like him, having folks like the Breyers, Tim Draper, and some of the others, we really wanted thoughtful, long-term technology investors that wouldn't push us to monetize, that would really allow us to kind of the freedom to get the science right, look for opportunities. And some of those opportunities, like Form Bio, came out significantly faster than we anticipated. Mm-hmm.
But you've also got some flashy, you got celebrity investors, right?
So we do have some pop culture investors. We definitely, like you saw a little bit of the demo reel, we've garnered over 50 billion media impressions with 98% positive or neutral feedback, which I think is amazing given today's world. Sure. Especially today's world. And so I think we've definitely struck the nerve and kind of hit into the kind of cultural zeitgeist of society. And so we have attracted some pop culture icons to it, which is fun. I think it makes it more relatable. All of them are very conservation focused, right? And so Paris is a big conservationist. Luke Hemsworth has kind of helped lead the charge of reintroducing, Luke and Chris have both led the charge of reintroducing Tasmanian devils back without the facial tumor disease back into their into their Southern Australia native habitat as well. So we've been pretty thoughtful about it in terms of who comes to the table, but anytime you can also get some of those folks from a brand voice perspective that are really leaning in and excited about not just the business, but the conservation angles, it's been pretty helpful. Yeah,
but that kind of ties into a question I have about why you specifically are the person to do this.
I don't know if that's I don't know if I have. I mean,
you don't know if you are.
Yet to see an extinct animal, right. So I don't know if I am the person to do this. Well, I think time will tell if I was.
But why did you think you probably could, or that you should take a shot at it?
I feel like, where I've been successful in my technology and investing career has really been in identifying and recruiting much smarter women and men than me. And so I feel like there's a lot of really great scientists. I feel like this is a systems problem coming from software. I felt like that we could apply a different model to a biotech company than I had seen, not ever building biotech. And then I also, I kind of cheated because I had the #1 person in the world as a co-founder, right? So that did make it easier having George. And then, we pulled together these incredible scientific advisors, like Beth and Lou Vidalin and Chris Mason and many others that kind of helped really shape and bring us into that community. And what was interesting is we've kind of like created this network of amazing scientists that had know each other, maybe collaborated here or there, but now are kind of like all adding their expertise to this larger problem.
Yeah, you mentioned when we spoke for the podcast that some of them were even detractors or critics before.
Yeah. We do get negative feedback, and I think it's important you can actually learn a lot more from folks that are negative, and that I like to think of them as informed critics. We occasionally get people we kind of get on the spectrums. You've got some of the Jurassic Park crowd that's just absolutely, hell yeah, we should just go do this because we should do this, right? And then on the other side, you've got people that also aren't necessarily that don't have a PhD in genomics. They're like, this is impossible from a genetics perspective. It's like, you work at a museum, and I don't know. I don't know if you have the right credentials to give us that feedback, right? But people that are really thoughtful and people that are really informed that give us that feedback, we take it very, very seriously. And a lot of times, we lean into those people. Some of those have joined our scientific advisory board, or some of those have even joined the company. And I think that's really important because, like I said, you learn a lot more from these informed people that have a really important voice to hear. Because we haven't done everything right. We're not going to do everything right. But I think the more transparent and receptive we are to that feedback, hopefully that'll be hopefully we can be a good steward of the vision.
Cool. This is a related question to why you, but why do you think you'll stick with this one? Because you're notoriously, you've done a lot of different things.
I get asked that question a lot, actually.
Why don't you get bored or have a call with somebody else and they'll kind of say, oh, and by the way, I want to invent moon colonies on Mars or whatever. And
there's lots of people working on that.
Right, that's true.
Yeah, I kind of found out the swim lane. No, I mean, it's a good question. I have no intention of leaving Colossal. I mean, we're a year and a half in. So I have no intention of leaving Colossal. I think it's something that's really important. I think this from my past, is I'm really passionate about climate change. So I feel like there's enough context switching here that it supports my ADD. So I have no reason to leave. There's always something new and weird and interesting I have really strange phone calls, not just about Pokemon, but I have really interesting meetings and calls.
Yeah, and you also mentioned something when we were talking before about that this really kind of you feel a passion about this that seems different than perhaps previous ventures, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can always, and people should build software companies. I mean, we at Colossal built a software company, Form Bio, right? So you should build software companies. But I felt like I could always go do that, and I feel like a lot of entrepreneurs, I have been guilty in the past of, I'm sure I don't know if you've heard this at TechCrunch, but we're building the software company to change the world. I don't know if you've heard the change.
No one's ever claimed that before.
You've never heard the technology entrepreneurs saying they're going to change the world. And so it's well, when you then get given the opportunity to potentially do it, if we're successful, with one of the icons of the industry, and you don't take it, then it's kind of hypocrisy, right? And so I felt like I got presented this really interesting opportunity. We're just coming out of COVID. Everyone kind of got to stay at their house and watch Netflix. It's is this the world I want to live in? Is this what I want to do with my life? And so I thought, well, maybe I'll go try this.
Nice.
So I have no intention of leaving.
Well, and so if you're not going to leave, so what does it look like? What can we expect from you in terms of next steps or announcements, or when do we get to see the first mammoth also? I think there was a date in the video, but
I think that date was off by a year-ish. Okay. But who knows? We've made a lot of progress in the last year and a half. That's given our investors and the folks that are around the table a lot of it. They've encouraged us to then expand. Part of why we've expanded these other species is the progress we've made on the mammoth, right? So we have an over 40-person team that's working just on the mammoth. Colossal itself, now nearly 90 people. We also support 30 postdocs in academic labs. So we have a lot of scientists work on these problems, right? And some of the milestones that we've made on the mammoth in just a short period of time, as well as the thylacine, have given our investors the confidence that maybe you could take on something new like the Dodo. And so for us, I think that 2028 is our goal for the mammoth. I think it's a realistic goal based on where we are today. for our 1.0 Mammoth. But I don't.
Yeah, is it a production Mammoth or is it?
Yeah, it's production Mammoth.
Okay.
It's not Gold Master, but it's up there for the old school gaming people here, like maybe Garrett. But 2028 is our goal. I think that we're on the path for that. If it didn't have a 22-month gestation in elephants, which we're not working to accelerate elephant developmental biology. I hope George doesn't see this, because if he sees this, he may give him an idea. We don't have bandwidth to work on that. But what's interesting is that some of the other species we're working on, given that they have much shorter gestations, it's highly likely we could even see one of those before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like the thylacine and the fat-tailed dunner, it's a 13.5-day gestation.
Right. That's okay.
Yeah,
quick
so
turnaround.
Yeah, quick turnaround. So we'll see.
What then do you do? Like, so you make your first production mammoth, right? And then,
Mammoths plural. So we're not making
mammoths plural.
Any of these species. Yeah.
So then what happens? Is it you set up Mammoth's World and everybody comes for tickets, or what? Like what is?
No,
it look like?
Our goal is every animal that we work on, we want to reintroduce back into their natural habitat. But that's a process. That rewilding process will take over a decade. You know, and so we've started now. That's in combination with indigenous people groups, private landowners, federal governments, state governments, and then the public at large, right? So we were up in Alaska. We held 2 different town halls and just invited people to come talk to us, give us their feedback. We met with indigenous people groups. The second largest Arctic Native corporation actually invested in Colossal, which was, I think, a testament to the project and what we're working on. The head of Fish and Wildlife at Alaska actually joined our conservation board, and so we're working very closely with them. We just got introduced to some folks in Canada, so we're starting those conversations there, and then we've also...
It's very personally interesting to me because that's where I'm from.
Yeah, well, if you could make some...
I'll make some calls for you.
If you could put
I'll call Trudeau. I have a direct line.
Put in a good word or 12. And so what's interesting is, that process of rewilding has to be very thoughtfully done. It's a very gated process. And then you have to but that's what we're starting at now, right? Because we're not looking for people to sign off on it. We're looking for people to be collaborators in it, right? And from day one. And so it takes a lot. I believe it's our responsibility to be transparent and educate the public when you're doing something this big and bold.
Sure.
And so we're trying to do that as best we can.
Well, it's the other side of world changing, right? You have to prepare the world for the change.
Yeah. So.
I think I forgot to do this up top, so I want to do it now. But to make sure that if you have questions, get the South by Southwest Go app, and then you can put the questions in there and interact with us, and they'll come up on the screen here. And we'll get to those in a little bit. But a question related to that I had as you were talking about it is, what do you do? Have you thought about the problem of poachers or things like that, right?
Yeah. So I mean, yes, and we've also had like I said, we get lots of strange questions. I'm predominantly vegetarian. I still eat meat though, and we get the "can we eat them?" question.
Right.
I'm not going to pick on any particular state government. It was not Alaska, because I've been talking about Alaska. It was not Alaska, but I do get that question more often than it's not comforting, but I get the "can we eat them?" question.
Right.
I was like, I feel like we got a lot of shit to eat here. We don't need to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to make new stuff to eat.
But as soon as you bring that back, a billionaire is going to try to eat that.
I mean, we've had that feedback. Not from our current bill, but we've had that feedback, which is really strange. And my response is, well, they're not, we'd have to go through an FDA process. We have no desire to go through an FDA process. We can't encourage you to eat them. And so we've kind of kicked that one way down the road, because we have no desire to I feel like it's a really weird thing to do, to bring species back to eat them. But we get those types of questions, all the time. So we need to be really thoughtful about, how to protect them. The poaching and the hunting one's another issue, right? And so any of our at some point, before you get to full sustainable breedable populations, you've got to really protect those species, right?
Yeah.
So we're working on that. We have built a biocontained facility already for our first mammoths, or for our first any species that it's not publicly available. That's under security.
Like a secret location.
It's not a secret location. It's just we want to make sure.
Well, then tell us where it is. No.
Yeah. on Google Maps. People will love the way that. But fundamentally, we want to ensure that the animals are best cared for. We want to make sure that they are monitored so that we understand the intended and unintended consequences of bringing them back, right, and rewilding them. So it's just, what's crazy is there's almost as much of work going into that as just the science.
Yeah, like as you're talking about it, it's just an immense task.
Yeah,
right?
we have a whole animal husbandry team, right, that just focuses on that, and not just, and then we have a separate rewilding team. So we've got these different teams that are just already focusing on this, and assuming success in the science.
Right, because you hear about things like the mosquito gene drive project proposals, right? And you think about, there's so much ethical consideration about what do you do once you start doing it.
There's definitely ethical considerations, but genetic engineering and synthetic biology, and I feel like sometimes gene drives get a lot of bad rap, but they could actually be really helpful, right? They can be massively helpful for delivering them. One of the issues that's plaguing Australia is the feral cat population, right? And so what are your choices? Your choices are you can go out and eradicate cats. I don't think that's probably hunting cats probably not the best idea.
Right.
I think that letting cats run wild that were introduced as invasive species that kill off and all your unique marsupials is probably not the right idea. So if you could create a gene drive where it let cats live out their natural lives, but then they weren't breedable, I think that's a really good thing. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people are scared of gene drives, but I think it's something that, like any of these technologies, needs to be very thoughtfully designed, built, and then deployed.
Right. So this is totally unrelated to that, but you mentioned that animal husbandry department. So talk me through a little bit of like company organization. Is it like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory in there? Like, how do you set up a company to do this kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's about as weird. I think it's as fun, but it's not as magical yet. But fundamentally, we break our species leads are almost like product managers. So it is kind of set up like a software company, surprise. And so we have product leads that are essentially our species leads are product leads, so they're like a product manager of a software organization. Then there's cross-functional teams around like embryology, animal husbandry, and computational biology that support the species leads. And then the species leads have their kind of direct engineers, if you will, that are doing all of the engineering work. And then we have weekly meetings that kind of like that kind of do the knowledge shares of like, is this like single nucleotide editing working versus this big delivery block of DNA working?
Do they have demos of the stand-ups? Is it like, show me your?
There are some demos. Like it's actually pretty cool. Like they. Every day or every week that I get kind of a progress report on some of these things in our species leads meeting, seeing embryos that are forming and watching how they're doing somatic cell nuclear transfer and moving cell and moving embryos, even intraspecies, it's just super fascinating. Yeah. So it's amazing. What's crazy is like when people come see the lab, they're like, wow, you have a lot going on, but you have to have the whole system to be successful, right? If we just did one piece of it, then you'd be like, then you'd let all those people go and then start over, and you'd have to start over like 12 times versus just build the infrastructure.
So for you as a CEO, does it feel like when you were running a software company in some ways?
It feels like a software company. There's different personalities in science.
Mm-hmm. Are they
than in
more difficult?
I think that engineers, traditional software and technology engineers, are very smart, and sometimes you get what comes with that. I feel like scientists are also very smart.
Right. Okay, leave it there.
We're very lucky to have all of them, and we're grateful to them.
Okay, so just then, sort of some more fun questions. But what if you had dream animal? What would you bring back? Have you thought about this a lot?
Besides the mammoth?
Well, this is that your top choice of all?
Yeah, out of everything, it really is my top choice. There was a giant beaver.
Yes, yeah.
Which I think is really
Canadian.
funny.
I know.
I think it's really funny. I think a giant beaver would be fun and weird and interesting. There was a giant armadillo that was cool. A lot of people ping us about the giant ground sloth. I don't know if any of these things are possible. We're not exploring them. I'm just saying that those are things that I think are really interesting. I do think that the stellar sea cow would be awesome.
Yeah.
And that is, transparently, it's something that we have looked into. There's just not a way to gest it yet.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe the beaver. It's kind of fun. Weird.
That's very fun. Yeah.
It's a giant beaver. It would just be interesting to see.
Yes. Yeah, it would. What's the best barbecue here in Austin?
Probably Franklin's.
Oh, okay, nice. I had that this time. It was delicious. Yeah, I think we're going to go to some of these Q&A questions because we got a ton here. Let's go to the top. So what are the risks that the new species, not perfect genetic equivalent, will have characteristics with unintended negative consequences? Oh, we talked a bit about that with the genetics, but is it a high risk?
So we're, this is a similar question that we sometimes get because there's been some media reports of like, oh, the permafrost, they've found this virus and it could be on
some great science fiction around this too, right?
So great science fiction around it. So we are de-extincting genes, right? So we are very thoughtful about it. We're not, sometimes people, some of the feedback we got early on was like, well, if you de-extinct the mammoth, there could be some secret virus.
Right, a hidden viral payload in there.
But we're very, that our geneticists and the technologies are advanced enough that we're de-extincting genes, and a lot of times we're just upregulating and downregulating existing genes. We're just making modifications to existing genes. So I think that we can be very mindful around what intended versus unintended consequences come from the edits. We're also, we also do a lot of functional assays and molecular tests. There's a whole process. We have a whole stem cell reprogramming group that has gotten to induce pluripotent stem cells in elephants, which is really, really hard, never been done before, that we've now achieved internally that we're now working to replicate before we start to look at publishing work on it. And fundamentally, that will allow us to derive different tissue types so that we can test some of these things before we go into Gold Master.
Right. But there's not really a chance that, like, you mentioned the genetic similarity with African elephants?
Asian elephants.
Asian elephants. So is there, could they crossbreed and then produce viable offspring?
Yeah, African elephants and Asian elephants have even been demonstrated to interbreed. So mammoths and Asian elephants, could have bred. And remember, what we're engineering is closer to an Asian elephant than a mammoth, so they could interbreed, right? There are certain ways around that if you want to. Those are some of the kind of the more big questions that we're having with conservation groups, given the declining number of elephants, by giving them a cold-tolerant adaptations where we can create sustainable populations with genetic diversity up in areas that don't have the same human-elephant conflict that they do in Africa and in Asia. That may be something that we want to do, right? So those are the types of conversations that we're having. We can also do things around biocontainment and whatnot that prevent them, but almost creates a subspecies for them. So we have some optionality around that in the engineering, and when we're just kind of working through what's the right approach.
That's great. So you must just you must have the top people in animal husbandry just knocking down your door all the time.
Yeah, it's great. Dr. Wendy Kiso, Dr. Wendy Kiso, she's amazing. She came from Whitehavens, who did all of the Ringley brothers rescue of elephants. So they're the largest population of Asian elephants in North America, in Florida. And so we hired her. She did all of that work, which is incredible. And we also get to work with Dr. Thomas Hildebrandt. He does all of the biorescue work on the northern white rhinos that are functionally extinct at this point. And so yeah, we're very fortunate. Recruiting is not
not a problem.
Not our issue. Yeah, it's, from a synthetic biology, if your choice is to work on yeast or extinct animals, we win. So we win that fight most times, not to. I don't need yeast.
Working on yeast is great.
Yeah.
And if you do
love
that,
yeast,
thank
please
you.
don't message me about that you hate me because I said something negative about yeast.
You're gonna get at replies. Yeah.
Yeah, I get stuff.
Another question here from Anonymous. Is there any research being done on how the extinction of those species has altered the ecosystem and how that can be reversed and if it's even preferable?
Yeah, so we're doing that right now. So there are published papers specifically in Arctic rewilding, which is really interesting. There are we are working on a paper right now on tropic downgrading with the thylacine. So what is the reintroduction of that keystone species back into the wild look like? We have not started any work yet on the dodo. The dodo is more of it's less of the impact of the dodo going back into the environment, and it's more about using the dodo as an excuse to rid some of the Mauritius and some of the neighboring islands around Mauritius from the invasive species that actually took them out, right? So it's a different kind of benefit to the ecosystem. So there are published papers on many of these topics, which I encourage you all to read. But then separately, we are working on a couple right now with kind of our own funded research.
Cool. Yeah.
And field work, which is kind of crazy.
The next one here also about intent negative consequence. I feel like you answered it at the top, so I'm going to skip that one there. But I'm going to go to one from Eric Wanning here, who is, could the ability to revive extinct species lead to, lead to even more destructive behavior? This is clearly a theme, so we gotta address it more, because I like his example.
No, it's a great one. Well,
who cares if whales go extinct?
Everyone should care if whales go extinct, because if whales go extinct, the warming oceans, we probably all die. Right. So everyone should definitely care about that.
But that's an interesting theory, that we could become callous and then just be like, well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and by the way, I do not think that Colossal is the solution to the biodiversity crisis. Right. I think that Colossal is bringing attention to the biodiversity crisis, and we're developing tools that are going into the hands of conservationists that we're giving to them for free and subsidizing some, and even subsidizing in cases that are really, really important. Like these incredible, people that are on the front line doing this great work, and sometimes putting their lives in danger for this work, they are massively undercapitalized. Yes. They don't have the money to even do what they're currently doing, let alone develop new technologies. And we know with what they're currently doing, while it works, it doesn't work at the scale and function that humanity destroys an environment or changes the environment, right? And so we've got to adapt better tools for that. And so investments have to go into it, and it just hasn't been flooding into it. Mm-hmm. And so if anything, I think that we tried to do a good job of talking about biodiversity and bringing this issue to the forefront. I just did a big thing with the World Economic Forum and released a big paper on the sixth mass extinction that we are currently in, and how these technologies can help. So we're trying to evangelize that, mm-hmm. and I think our partners in conservation are doing a good job bringing it to people's attention. But this does not replace existing conservation. Right. Existing conservation is absolutely critical. We just want to help them.
Yeah. So you bring up something here about that. Those things have traditionally been starved of funding necessarily, right? But what about the criticism that you are adding to that by, people are funding you now and maybe not funding something that is potentially more practical or more.
I think that everybody that wants to fund, and a lot of times we get feedback saying, can we buy Colossal stock from some random person? Yeah. And our advice is the best thing the answer is no, but the best advice that the best thing you can do is go support one of our conservation partners. So we actually draw, all the links on our site, click straight through to the donate of that, because it's the number one thing people can do. I like to sometimes say that, we didn't go to the Gates Foundation and all these different people that are giving money to conservation. We didn't take money away from conservation. We brought new money to conservation. Right. I'd argue there's one less shitty software company in the world because we exist, right? And so, that's making, not that there's anything wrong with software, but fundamentally, we brought new eyes to it. We're trying to bring the awareness to it, but then we're also bringing new money to it. And I don't know if every single company, if I've been asked the question before, why don't you just go raise money for, elephant or rhino conservation? I don't know if I can do that. That doesn't mean there's not incredible people that can go do that. They should do that. Right. That's just not my skill set. So this is what we are doing, and we want to collaborate and get as much feedback as possible. But people still need to support these existing causes.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a ton of sense, right? It's not like there is a set global budget out there for dollars that go into conservation.
Yeah. And I think at scale, one of our internal goals is we would like to be the largest single donator, not just of technology, but of money to conservation once we hit the scale that we think we can hit.
Right. Once you start selling mammoths for $10 million a head, or
there's not a ticket price on private ownership of mammoths.
Okay, great.
Yeah. I did get those questions recently, though, with some of the world travels we had. So yeah.
Okay. Here's a question from Jason Delborn. How does this strategy create the genetic diversity that would be necessary for a successful reproducing population? That's a great question.
That's a great question, yeah. And so it's different per species, right? And so in some case, you have lots of preserved samples. not to continually pick on Beth, but one of the main technologies that Beth Shapiro and her husband developed was technologies around getting great DNA out of hair. And so like with the thylacine, there's one miracle pup, right? So there was like, we as humanity and really Andrew Pass got lucky and got a 91% complete genome on the first read. That's that's rare for a lot of things, specifically ancient DNA. But what's interesting is there's 200 plus pelt samples that we've identified. And so we can actually take those individual pelts, use some of the technology that Beth Shapiro and Ed developed, and then actually kind of understand to do population genetic studies, right? So that we can then engineer in that genetic diversity, right? And then once you get to the right sizable populations, then they can interbreed and you're fine. We're doing the same thing with mammoths. So we worked with 54 mammoth genomes. 44 of those came from Lou Vidalin from the University of Stockholm, and he's been wonderful to work with. And we just funded a project with the University of Alaska Fairbanks and with the University of Stockholm to actually sequence and do radiocarbon dating on Alaskan mammoths, because most of the work's been done on Siberian mammoths. There's not a ton of work that's been done on there's not nearly as much that's been done on Alaskan mammoths. And so they've got all these samples. We're doing the radiocarbon dating so that we can pair that, understanding their flow and their migration patterns, also coupled with some of the genetic diversity that we hopefully get from that sequencing, right? And so we've agreed to do 200 mammoths, right? Wow. And so we are constantly trying to push that, and so that's not for us to get to our successful first herd. That's to really start to build our understanding of population genomics for genetic diversity engineering.
Yeah. So when you get to, do you know what the magic number is for when they can start reproducing on their own?
I don't. Someone on our team that's much smarter than me probably does.
And but does it differ?
It's more than one.
Species or? Okay, we'll leave it at that.
Yeah,
I'll follow up with you later.
It's definitely more than one.
This is another nightmare situation question here. How far can you deviate from the genetic code of an animal before you go into a Jurassic Park-esque situation? Is there any way to know? I mean, you've outlined some of the measures you're taking already.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I think that where we as humanity aren't at the place that we can engineer a full, complete genome of something, right? And so that's why you can't do full cloning of like extinct animals or whatnot. But at the same time, I think that you can engineer in, for us to do the amount of engineering that we are doing on these animals is a lot. So the idea to do significantly more than that would just take a lot of time, take a lot of money. I don't know what the cost-benefit analysis would be, right, to get to kind of that state.
Right.
But it would just take a lot of effort to get past. So we are in the business of thinking about, okay, what is the minimal number of edits that we can take, not the maximum number of edits, right? Because that's $1 trillion. And so we're trying to be very thoughtful about narrowing it down so that we're kind of doing the things that have the most impact to our phenotypes and filling that ecological void versus just engineering for fun.
Yeah,
that's your Pokemon question.
Right, and the answer is capital.
It's a scarier version of your
Like a capital efficiency limit kind of prevents you from building the...
Yeah, I mean, we're just trying to be pragmatic, right? It's like, let's get here and then reevaluate.
Right. What kind of regulatory oversight do you anticipate? You probably are already talking to regulators.
Yeah, so we get a lot of questions around this, and we've been very transparent about this. But one of our investors is In-Q-Tel, which has a government affiliation, and so we work very closely with the federal government. We work very closely with Fish and Wildlife and some of the other groups that kind of oversee this. The two big areas are long-term rewilding. You have to work with into public lands. You really have to work with EPA or EPA equivalents in other countries. You should work with all the people I mentioned earlier, right? With the private landowners and indigenous groups, in other words. But you have to work with them. And then also, if you wanted to go, this is the question. We are never going to do this, but this was the question. If you wanted to go in to produce animals for encouraged human consumption, you have to go through an FDA regulated process, of course, which is not something that we're interested in.
Right, and you're also not, I asked you this before, but just so this whole audience can hear this, you're not building battle mammoths.
No, we're not building battle mammoths at all, so that's not on the roadmap.
Okay.
We're building the fluffier, nicer ones.
The friendly ones.
So no battle mammoths in our current future. That came up with the In-Q-Tel question.
Yes, it did. Yeah. Okay,
I don't know if In-Q-Tel or their clients would want like bigger, robust animals.
Yeah, they want secret, stealthy little animals, right?
So we're making micro mammoths.
Don't say that.
No, we're not really making micro mammoths. Yeah, elephants never forget, so they're.
This question is from, sorry if I mispronounced this, Mehalani Kawahi. This year, approximately 4 species of native Hawaiian honeycreepers will become extinct in the wild. How could this tech prevent extinction?
Well, we don't have any way to clone birds currently. So somatic cell nucleotransfer doesn't work. There's not enough money going into bird conservation and genetic rescue around birds, right? And so one of the things that I think that we've been thoughtful about is when we decided to take this on, a fundamental area that we as Colossal, and we have to solve it for the success of the Dodo, we also have to solve it, as humanity, is creating alternatives to being able to clone or engineer birds. And right now there's a process that we're going to attempt, which is editing what's called primordial germ cells, or PGCs, right? And so, but just cultivating those could take a month, could take 5 years. Mike McGrew, who's one of our, from the Roslin Institute, who's one of our scientific advisors, has successfully done this in chickens. And so he's helping us on the PGC and on the conservation aspect. He's not actively working on the Dodo project. But what's really interesting is we really have to get that right and replicatable for pigeons so that we can apply it to other birds.
Oh, okay, great. William Flanagan.
But that's something that then we'll give the world that knowledge.
Yeah, right, because
we'll publish science
mentioned
on it. We're just going to give that world on it, yeah.
Now, what is actually related to that? So, how do you do that decision making about like this is beneficial to conservation, and then therefore should be made free?
Well, I mean, we've got a whole conservation advisory board, top tier conservation for conservationists all over the world. We've got a lot of great scientists who are on our scientific advisory board that do a lot in conservation, right? So we kind of get that natural feedback, and then we have the partners, right? And so we do briefings quarterly with all those groups of what we're working on, and then we take that feedback. We have our own ideas, right? That's mostly stemming from our animal husbandry group, but when we get those ideas from when we share our progress with our advisory boards, a lot of times they say, oh, this would be really helpful.
So it's kind of like a technology buffet that they can select from.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit more systematic than that. So, yeah, you can't go back twice.
Right. William Flanagan asks, have you developed viable wild population estimates for the 3 species? Oh, this is what I asked, and the answer was more than one.
Oh, yeah,
but
more than one. Yeah. So we have people working on this right now, and what's great is like one of our partners, Rewild, which is Leonardo DiCaprio's one of his foundations. We work very closely with them, and their entire premise of their nonprofit is the reintroduction of species back into the wild, right? And so that's like 90% of what they do. So they also do a really good job of working with small populations of animals. We're currently working with them and the Indonesian government on the Sumatran rhino. So it's not, the Sumatran rhino isn't quite in the shape of the northern white rhinos, where there's only functionally 2 left. They're functionally extinct with only 2 left. But there's sub 40 left in Indonesia, and so how can some of these genetic rescue technologies apply to them? And then at what point does that population collapse because you just don't have genetic diversity? And so we rely heavily on our partners for those types of questions.
Right, but there are people who are expert in that.
Yeah, that devote their I don't think we will ever be the perfect rewilding. I don't think Colossal's rewilding team will be the ones that are out there, working with mammoths back into the field, right? I think we will work and rely on much smarter partners that have done this for 50 years.
Right.
And so that kind of network and kind of transparency and collaboration, I think is fundamentally key to our success.
Do you ever anticipate you're at the scale where you start building an ecosystem around you of companies that can handle various parts of this?
I think that most likely the Colossal ecosystem that could arise is, they'll have spin-offs that are more directly related to human healthcare. We've got a lot of requests for a category that I'll call directed evolution, right? Where we've got people that are working on coral. They're you have all of the people in technologies and infrastructure to work on this coral restoration project. And so we're not currently doing that. That's something that we've talked about exploring. So I do think over time there could be some type of Colossal ecosystems around that, but I think those are going to be choices of where to collaborate that either add value, either help combat climate change, or help advance some of the work in biodiversity. So I think we'll be pretty thoughtful. Everything else, I think either we won't do, or if it has application to human healthcare, we'll spin it out and have someone else do it.
So Marcita Mesti asks, my son is 12. He's in his 4th year of Python programming. He wants to direct movies now, but he's fascinated with your work. What should he study to work with you?
Genetics. I think that, well, we're such a cross-functional team. I think, if you have a passion for it, you could probably, do anything. But I think that the field of synthetic biology is going to be one that I would highly, highly encourage. Because whether it's movies, I think it'll open your eyes to all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that it could have meaningful impact on this.
For sure. Fernanda Romano asks, have you considered looking into plants and bacteria that have gone extinct?
So we do have a group that has approached us around directed evolution around a couple of microbes that could be beneficial to combating climate change. We are not working on that currently. We are not working on any microbes or plants. It's a different set of teams and skill sets. There's other great companies out there that really specialize on it. I think that there could be opportunities for us to collaborate if it really fits in our wheelhouse. But we're not building those capabilities. We're not actively building those capabilities at this time.
Okay. Do you think they would have a major kind of like impact in terms of conservation efforts? Or?
I mean, you're seeing lots of really great stuff, right? Like I've seen some really interesting plastic degradation work, where microbes naturally break down plastics. I've seen some really interesting work around genetic modification of plants for carbon sequestration. So I think there's a lot of interesting technologies that are kind of like, or I'd say climate change combating technologies that are coming from synthetic biology. And I think synthetic biology can play a major role in combating climate change.
Okay. This is another, I'm going to skip the first one here just because we've already kind of answered it a bunch of times. But this one's interesting for the last couple of minutes we have here. Luis Felipe Caetano asks, can you walk us through the exact process of a de-extinction? So do you impregnate a regular elephant with the mammoth DNA so a mammoth is born, or what are the steps?
Yeah, so this is the super non-technical, because I'm not a scientist, but this is the high-level process. So you have to be able to assemble enough DNA of the extinct species to build a reference or close to reference genome. You then have to do the sequencing and build a reference genome for its closest phylogenetic relative. In the case of the mammoth, that's the Asian elephant. Once you do that, you do comparative genomics to understand where the difference is, like what makes a mammoth versus an Asian elephant. And once you have your kind of complete gene list, you can do literature reviews, functional assays, and a myriad of different tests, start isolating what those genes do and how they apply. And so then once you have that gene list, you use a combination of tools from single nucleotide editing, so editing the individual rung of the twisted little ladder that is us, and then, bigger opportunities like actually synthesizing and actually creating big blocks of DNA and swapping it in, or even just like knockouts with like CRISPR-Cas9. And so there's kind of a myriad of different tools. We kind of use all of them because our engineering projects are complex, and so we kind of need all of them in each one of our projects. And then once you get that edited cell, you do all of this in somatic cells. You then go through a process called somatic cell nucleotransfer, or cloning, where you take the nucleus of that and put it into that of a germ cell. And then your choice is, it's kind of a choose your own adventure at that point. You can either go the surrogacy route, so all of the species that we're working on, surrogacies are viable options. But we also have a 17-person team that's working on ex utero development or artificial wombs. And so our long-term hope is that's part of this de-extinction toolkit that we can use to give to conservationists, where in the case of the northern white rhino, they could grow 20 of them in a lab,
right,
and then work with incredible rewilding partners to put them back into to rewild them back with all the animal husbandry and mothers and everything that they have to do.
And then once they come to term, it's just sort of taking care of
it's just taking care of them.
Yeah. All right, Ben, I think that about does it for time. But do you want to give me the exclusive on the mammoth when the first one you get? You gonna promise me that, right?
We love TechCrunch, and we will always bring interesting innovations to you.
Okay, that's a great non-answer. Thanks very much, Ben. I really appreciate you being here.